Hello, and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the show where every week I look at a book that was important to James Ellroy. For this week's show, I'm going to be doing something slightly different. I will be discussing a book that Ellroy detests. In fact, he's called it the most overrated book in American literature. However, I think that this book is too big and too important to the history of 20th century American literature. I don't think we can ignore it. Its influence is felt everywhere, and is certainly felt in some ways in James Ellroy's work. Okay, the book in question is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Now, before I start, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. Every time you do that, you support the show, and it helps with YouTube's algorithm, and you'll have all the new episodes delivered right to your inbox. Okay, so Truman Capote was born Truman Streckfus Persons in 1925 in New Orleans. He had a very troubled childhood. Because of his parents' divorce, he was moved around a lot. He lived all over the South, and his father was something of a sponger, and his mother eventually died of an overdose. And these events kind of traumatized him for the remainder of his life. But from a very early age, once he settled in New York and he started getting acclaimed short stories published, he became a literary darling. In fact, he was one of the most famous writers in America before he'd even got a full-length book out. And that shows you some of his genius for publicity, not only in creating a persona that came very naturally to him as, an almost extravagantly gay man in like conservative post-war America, and his mixing with socialites, the cream of society, movie stars, aristocracy. And then when he finally did get books out, such as Other Voices of the Rooms, The Grass Harp, Breakfast at Tiffany's, those are the novels, and then non-fiction books like The Muses Are Heard, released to great acclaim. So he was very, very famous and successful very young. Then in 1959, you might say that fate intervened, because on page 39 of the New York Times one day, he sees a little box article that says, a family of four, the Clutter family, have been murdered in their home in Holcomb County, Kansas. Very, very small piece, but it piqued his interest. He goes out there with Harper Lee, his friend and fellow writer. He begins to research the case. The perpetrators are apprehended, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. They were acting on false rumors that Herb Clutter, the father, had a safe full of cash. And Capote ends up spending time with these two killers in custody. And he's particularly taken with Perry Smith, who seemed like this, autodidact, this man who really wanted to better himself, but was trapped in this kind of criminal underworld. And some researchers said he had certain feelings for him, possibly, but in a sense, I think that's a distraction. If anything, more scholars have said he was kind of exploiting these two men, because he had the book deal. The publicity that he'd already generated for the book was hitting fever pitch. He always managed to generate great publicity prior to a book coming out. But he felt that he couldn't finish the book until the two men were executed. They'd been sentenced to death, but the appeals process was dragging on and on and on. And it got to the point it took him 6 years, and he had first, 2/3 of the book done, and then he had everything done except the final chapter. And then finally they were executed, and Capote witnessed that execution, and he remained traumatized for life over it. But it allowed him to actually get the book done, and it came out to great success, both critically and commercially, one of the all-time great sellers. And Capote had even said when he was drumming up publicity, with this book I have created a new literary form, and that is the non-fiction novel. Now that might sound something of an oxymoron, but what he kind of meant by that was that you can take certain elements of the novel and certain elements of non-fiction, combine them, often in a true crime story that became one of the kind of standard texts for the non-fiction novel. So you could take character development and narrative arcs and this discussion of landscape, and you merge them, and pretty soon afterwards there was a rush to get these sort of books out. First there was Norman Mailer's Armies of the Night, and then Joseph Wambaugh, who was a protege of Capote's, wrote numerous books that could be called non-fiction novels. Actually, Capote even blurbed one, he endorsed one, and that was The Onion Field. Sadly, it was kind of over. That was as good as it was ever going to get for Capote. He released a few book length, like The Dog's Bark and also Music for Chameleons, but they tended to be shorter pieces, anthologies. He was talking about releasing a new book, Answered Prayers, and he'd received a huge advance for it, and he'd already sold the film rights for it. This is how hot he was at the time. And it was going to be something of an expose of his famous friends. And when it was released in a bridge format in numerous magazines, the backlash from all of his friends who felt they'd been completely betrayed by him was ferocious. So it was never published in book form in his lifetime. It was published after his death as an unfinished novel. Capote went into a spiral of drug and alcoholism, broke up with his life partner Jack Dunphy, and wound up with usually much younger men who to some extent abused him, although in other ways he was kind of abusing them as well. Lost his friends, lost his talent, and it was considered a kind of great loss for American literature when he died at the age of 59, that he'd spiraled completely out of control. And if you want an absolutely vivid depiction of that decline, read Gerald Clark's excellent biography, Capote. It is very, very sad towards the end, because you think what could have been. We could have, even his doctors towards the end were saying, "You're a thief. You're robbing the world of just incredible talent, but by destroying yourself." So, where does this come in with James Ellroy, and especially as he says that he's hated the book? Well, Ellroy actually does love a book that preceded In Cold Blood, and could in some ways be described as an early non-fiction novel, because Capote's In Cold Blood attracted some criticism at the time from critics like Kenneth Tynan, who said, "You just wanted those men to be killed so you could write your book." And that criticism has snowballed over the years, to the extent where a lot of research has been done in digging up Capote's very shoddy research practices. None of his conversations were recorded. That was actually against prison regulations when it comes to the two killers, Smith and Hickok. So he would write up furious notes afterwards with Harper Lee. But he felt strongly that the minute you take out a dictaphone, people clam up. You've got to just talk to them as a conversation. That's when they're at the most relaxed. So all of the quotes are from memory. Some are fictitious. The actual final scene of the book is fictitious. Capote said he needed a kind of slightly lighter ending, a kind of full circle of the story to get away from the kind of grim execution scene. But the book in question that preceded In Cold Blood was Compulsion by May 11, which is a book that James Ellroy absolutely adores. And what that is a roman éclair about the Leopold and Loeb murder. And Leopold and Loeb in the story are called Strauss and Steiner. But Compulsion, which was a sizable hit in its time, it's a big bestseller followed by a movie adaptation, but it's gone out of print. It's been republished a few times, and in fact, Ellroy wrote the introduction one time. It follows the kind of non-fiction novel format very, very precisely, in terms of it is the story of Leopold and Loeb and all of their characteristics, their mannerisms, their quirks, and the twists and turns of the case. The clues the detectives picked up on are almost exactly the same. The only thing is, it's a novel and there are name changes. And Ellroy himself was actually a huge fan of Joseph Wambaugh, who, wrote The Onion Field and Echoes in the Darkness. He actually wrote probably more non-fiction novels than anybody else. And, his work was endorsed by Truman Capote. And Wambaugh actually spoke to me. I knew him a little bit before he died. He said, I knew I'd write The Onion Field the day I was a guest at Truman Capote's Palm Springs house. And I talked him through the case. And at the end of it, Capote said, oh, I would love to write that book. It's a wonderful case. And Wambaugh said, if it's good enough for the writer of In Cold Blood and it's good enough for me, I'm going to write this book. And to huge success. So it's not the non-fiction novel really that Ellroy is against. What I think it is to make my point, is I'm just going to read you the very famous opening paragraph of In Cold Blood. Page 1. The village of Holcomb stands on the high wheat plains of western Kansas, a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. Some 70 miles east of the Colorado border, the countryside with its hard blue skies and desert clean air has an atmosphere that is rather more far west than Middle West. The local accent is barbed with a prairie twang, a ranch hand nasalness, and the men, many of them wear frontier narrow trousers, Stetsons, and high-heeled boots with pointed toes. The land is flat and the views are awesomely extensive. Horses, herds of cattle, a white cluster of grain elevators rising as gracefully as Greek temples are visible long before a traveller reaches them. Okay, well, first of all, that's great writing because you're there, you can see it. You open the pages and suddenly you're in this world that's popping up on the page before you. Have the mountains, the plains, and the colours and the skies. Also, what Capote's doing is he's building it up so that this explosion of violence, the murder of 4 people, the father, the mother, the son, the daughter, children, 2 children, is like an aberration on this world. It's not to say that Kansas is some paradise, far from it. It's in some ways it's a hard world. It requires, people have to work the land and work the landscape, and but it's a hard world, but it's a good world. There's a kind of dignity to it. Maybe it's a kind of conservative dignity in terms of, people are proud of the work. The church is very kind of solid in the area. People have somewhat inflexible principles. Although, that being said, it wasn't entirely conservative. Reading in Gerald Clark's biography, one of the things that Capote did when he went there is he'd be working on the case in the day and he'd go to a transvestite show at night. Kansas was actually something of a transvestism hub at the time in the US. But this murder intrudes on that world, almost as if the blood, the colour red, is a colour intrusion on a somewhat drab but fixed world. And Ellroy, doesn't believe in that philosophy in terms of his crime stories. In his world, and bear in mind Ellroy's Christian, the world has already fallen. You don't need to, as a crime writer, you don't need to break up any paradise. So there's always, despicable acts, either sexually and, physical crime and murder. Murder is always there in Ellroy's Los Angeles. However, I think the one novel of Ellroy's that kind of represents a non-fiction novel and might be the closest to In Cold Blood in some ways is The Black Dahlia. Now, when I say it's a non-fiction novel, obviously, there are name changes. Well, the detectives are fictional. Bucky Blycott, Lee Blanchard, and the woman in her life, Kate Lake, the woman who comes between them. These are all fictional characters. Elizabeth Short, the victim, is a real character. However, Elizabeth Short's murder is so grotesque. The torture, which I'm not going to repeat here, because if you're Ellroy readers, you already know about it. The torture is so grotesque that even in this fallen world of post-World War II boomtown LA, where the nightclubs, the porn, the organized crime, there's gangsters, there's hustlers, there's pimps, the streetwalkers, and just criminals of every conceivable stripe. Even in that world, the murder of Elizabeth Short is, this horrible interruption of that world. It is so grotesque and so vile that the case needs to be solved. They're under a lot of, the LAPD's under a lot of pressure to solve this case, to restore some semblance of the order that existed before. Now, that's not to say that that the murder happens and then suddenly people are exploiting it. Right away, there's 5 LA newspapers that were in circulation wars that they're happy because they've got a hot story. So in many ways, the hucksterism kicks in immediately with her murder. And this was the only novel of Ellroy's, either before or since, where he did so much research himself. In subsequent novels, as he got richer, as he got more famous, he would hire researchers. If he's writing historical fiction, he wants to know about the Vietnam War and the dates and everything. He got researchers who's going to get that all right. He's got fact checkers and everything. But he was not famous until this book. So, he discussed the research process with me. He would go to, New York Public Library with like free pillowcases, reinforced, full of quarters, and get on Interlibrary Loans all of the newspapers. And he recreated, day by day, the police investigation by those newspaper reports. Okay, what have they got now? Now they've got letters going into the police. Now they've got physical evidence. And he recreated the police investigation that way. And that's probably the closest he's come to a non-fiction novel. And I'm actually writing a piece now for Clues, a Journal of Detection, where I'm talking about some of the surprising links between James Ellroy and the non-fiction novel, a form he absolutely hates. I'm also co-editing the piece with Nathan Ashman, who's a friend of mine and also an Ellroy scholar. So yeah, In Cold Blood. Now, you might think it's the most masterpiece. You might hold the consensus opinion. You might also think, like James Ellroy, it's the most overrated book in American literature. I feel like recently some critics have come round to Ellroy's point of view because there's been a lot of research on the sort of kind of callous side of Capote's character and flaws in his research. I mean, there have been 2 films made about the making, about Capote's role in the whole affair. Capote and Infamous. And in both, he comes across sympathetic but also usurious. There was only one film made about the actual case where Capote is not in it, and there was also a miniseries made of it. But it is a huge story. And, if you love true crime or any crime narrative, or if you love American literature, I think it's still a story that needs to be read, and it's a very powerful book. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Remember to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and I'll see you next time. And next week we'll be going back to the more conventional narrative where I'll be talking about a book Ellroy truly loves. Okay, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.